Hello and welcome. My name is Yves Sanford, and today we are going to talk about a case study of a Swiss manufacturing company. So when we talk about this Swiss manufacturing company, let's have a quick look on what the current state of their situation was. They had basically within Switzerland 2 manufacturing plants. And each one of these manufacturing plants had its own little data center in them. This was working perfectly fine for this company as they were growing over the last few years, or 50 years now. The data centers had their own interconnectivity with an IP link in between, so all of that was perfectly fine and existing. However, as this customer is constantly growing, they had a few challenges to solve. They basically had no more space for new gear. So it's getting more and more challenging for them to host any new equipment in the infrastructure. Any change we would be allowed to do would require us to do this without nearly zero downtime. And on top of all of that, we had to deal with bad connectivity. So even though there was the link between the 2 data centers, the bad connectivity was actually the biggest inhibitor for most of the immediate options which came to mind. So as we were looking at this overall scenario, the customer came up by themselves with a few ideas. So one of the ideas was to just take one of the existing data centers and expand it by adding more space to it. So really physically expanding the building and actually building a bigger data center on top of that. The challenge with that approach and why we couldn't use that approach was very, very simple. This approach would take too long. So the reason for that was, as this project started in the midst of the pandemic, the challenge with this approach was we couldn't get hardware for the new data center. And on top of that, we were challenged that even building infrastructure and builders were hard to get hold of. So after that discussion with the customer, we thought it's like, okay, we could do outsourcing, just go into a public data center or something else. In the end, that was not a feasible option either because we still had the connectivity issue. So we identified that one of the first things we have to solve is the bad connectivity. So how did we approach the bad connectivity? We took a look at the existing IP uplinks, and what we figured out is that it was not completely unreliable, but it just had outages throughout the day. So the first thing we established as this IP uplink down here was also used to connect all of this to the public internet bubble. We actually identified and discussed with the customer that we would put now an additional uplink between the 2 data centers and use that uplink also to connect to the internet. So while that additional uplink did not solve by itself the connectivity issues, because we couldn't actually get all of this over a BGP uplink or something like that, so we had to deal with changing IP addresses. What we ended up doing in the solution for the IP scenario was that we put VMware SD-WAN on top of it. So instead of using just IP, we actually created another bubble around this, as you might say, and integrated VMware SD-WAN into the solution, also formerly known as VeloCloud. The SD-WAN solution basically solved more or less this issue completely off the list. So we no longer had bad connectivity, but instead connectivity was reliable and fast. So that solved the biggest problem we had as an interconnectivity between the two data centers. So no more worries about this guy here. But still we had the issue with the data center. However, now that we had the wonderful scenario that we could actually leverage the better internet connectivity and the interdata center connectivities, one of the next ideas was that we are going to look at our friends at AWS and leverage VMware Cloud on AWS and build a new SDDC up here. So the idea was now for this specific customer that we use the SD-WAN connection to link into the VMC on AWS environment and allow the customer to move workloads out of each of one of their SDDCs on-prem into the public cloud. So what we ended up doing is leveraging tools like HCX and others to migrate the actual VM workloads from here and from here up into the VMC on AWS cloud. With that being said, the customer was able to move over 80% of their workloads from the on-prem data centers into VMware Cloud on AWS. Why only 80%? The remaining are depending on some specific GPUs and everything else. So we are currently in the evaluation process to figure out if we can find better solutions for that. But the advantage with this approach is, as we could leverage HCX and other solutions, we had to deal with basically no downtimes. And we could immediately solve the no space problem because we are now up in the cloud. On top of all of this, the customer now has the wonderful scenario that they can expand in the cloud. If at any point in time they, for example, would open up a new manufacturing somewhere else, we could easily expand into another VMC on AWS setup somewhere in the public cloud. For example, in Singapore or wherever we need that, and actually apply the same logic, the same build blocks to that new VMC on AWS scenario. So long story short, within less than 30 days, we, from the first talk to the customer, working down the issues they had, deploying SD-WAN in the infrastructure to fix the biggest problem, the bad connectivity, solving that and actually using that as a vehicle to move the customer into VMC on AWS. They can run now the majority of their workloads already in VMC. We hope to get the other applications there too, and then work with the customer on the next iteration of their journey in modernizing their applications. So stay tuned for the next part of the journey.